Okay. So my opponent argued that NATO should not fast-track Ukraine into the alliance, so I'll be arguing, obviously, on the other side of that NATO should fast-track Ukraine into the alliance in order to end this conflict and keep Ukraine as an alive and happy nation. So my opponent made the argument that Ukraine would have to pay to get into NATO. And as a country that's already stretched thin, it would be hard to overcome that. But I would argue that this is worth it for the resources and defenses against Russia going forward in the future. All NATO countries have to contribute to the common fund in order for NATO to operate. This funding covers NATO's operations, facilities, and jointly owned equipment. So it's not that it's only the Ukraine that has to pay, it's all of the NATO countries. And it's just a bullet that the Ukraine would have to bite. But at this point, I think it would be a successful move to gain the support that they need. And then my opponent also brought up the GDP spending commitments. So NATO member countries have to commit to spending at least 2% of their annual GDP on national defense or military spending. At this point in time, the Ukraine has released their budget for 2025, and according to the Wilson Center, which provides nonpartisan insight into global affairs, Ukraine already plans to spend around 27% of their GDP on defense and internal security. So that's money that they would already be spending in their defense effort against Russia. And so in this conversation, one of the big kind of points is Russia's geographic proximity to NATO countries, and that's what makes Russia agitated when the NATO conversation comes up. So my opponent highlighted how joining NATO isn't a good idea because it would agitate Russia. Russia wants NATO countries as far away as possible from its borders, and so thus provoking Russia could lead to a potentially catastrophic outcome. While this line of reasoning seems logical, I think it's pertinent to learn from history. During the Cold War, countries that bordered Russia became under Russian control, and they were known as what's called the Iron Curtain. They're essentially just a protective buffer from the West for Russia. And so how is Russia obtaining Ukraine as a buffer any different than before? It's kind of, in my mind, a first step towards Russia maybe making a leap towards an aggressive move that could end up in a world war. So I'd like to argue that if the common goal is to stop the conflict and eliminate the threat of world war, then is Russia supposed to just have Ukraine? And if so, if that's the solution to avoid conflict between NATO and Russia, then what happens after that? If Russia gets control, will they keep expanding? So that we just don't know what would happen. So in order to stop that, NATO needs to be brought in, or I guess Ukraine needs to be brought into NATO to get that support to stop the conflict dead. My opponent talked a lot about how NATO would be spread too thin if the Ukraine joined. And so I don't think that NATO really is spread too thin. NATO's biggest player, which is the U.S., spends almost as much on defense as the next 10 spenders in the world combined. In 2023, this is about $916 billion, according to Statista. And that's not going to change in the future either, because Donald Trump is committed to NATO and will not pull the U.S. out of the alliance once he takes office next year. And that's said by the UK Defense Secretary, John Healey. And then NATO's resources will also be bolstered by two new countries, Sweden and Finland, as they both joined recently. And then my opponent kind of also mentioned how admitting Ukraine would lower NATO's standards and other countries would have to be admitted as well, and thus spreading NATO too thin. But if other countries are being admitted, then new money and new resources are going to NATO. So I don't think it necessarily means that it's spreading NATO too thin. It's just broadening NATO's horizons, but broadening NATO's scope. And so then in conclusion, if we're to support the continued life of Ukraine as a nation, as a people who have rich and vibrant culture, which I think is the ethical thing to do as citizens of the world, then fast-tracking a membership into NATO is the correct course of action. And this is the correct course of action because NATO has an open door policy, which allows any European country to join if it meets the following criteria. It's prepared to meet the standards and obligations of membership. In my first speech, I talked about how the Ukraine does meet those standards and obligations, and it contributes to the security of the alliance. I think that at this point in time, Ukraine would contribute to the security of the alliance, especially how they're not a huge nation, but they do have power and a good military that they could potentially in the future, if they're still a nation, could contribute to other global conflicts. And then the last part of the open door policy is that it shares NATO's values of freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law. And the Ukraine just fulfills all those criterias. So that's the reason why fast-tracking a membership into NATO for Ukraine is like can be done and is the correct course of action.